I found people saying, what can we do? Is there anything we can do? We're up against something enormous and irrational. The terrible thing about what we're living through is the espousal of lies is presented as conscience. Don't try to give people the history of the world. Don't think that you're going to change their whole way of thinking. The most you can hope for is to open what is a closed mind just a crack. If you manage to open it just a crack, then you've done terribly well.
Hello, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I'm Freya, and we are here to have a conversation with Melanie Phillips on her new book, Fighting the Hate, a Handbook for Jews Under Siege. I hope you've all got your copy. For those who are new to Feminists Against Anti-Semitism, we are a grassroots feminist organisation committed to opposing anti-Semitism consistently and without exception, including when doing so is uncomfortable, socially costly, or politically unfashionable. Over the past few years, and especially since October the 7th, many Jewish women and allies have found themselves navigating profound ruptures in friendships, workplaces, community groups, universities, political movements, and even in families. Many people who once felt politically at home are now isolated, silenced, or pressured into self-erasure simply for naming anti-Semitism when they encounter it. Tonight's discussion is intended to speak directly to this devastating reality. Melanie Phillips has spent decades writing and speaking about anti-Semitism, political extremism, media narratives, and the pressures facing liberal democratic societies. In Fighting the Hate, Melanie provides the help that so many Jewish people and their allies have been crying out for, offering detailed advice across political and ideological spectrums. It is a clear and concise rebuttal to the tsunami of disinformation that dominates today's discourse. Tonight's event is not a lecture, and it's not about demanding ideological conformity. One of the reasons we wanted this event to be participant-led is because so many women are carrying deeply personal experiences that rarely get discussed openly. The loss of trust, the fear of speaking, the exhaustion of constantly having to justify one's humanity, or the uncertainty about how to challenge prejudice without destroying relationships and communities in the process. This is why we've asked you, our members and supporters, to submit your questions for Melanie. Some of these have already been sent, and I'll ask them to get us going. And I really hope many more will come up during this chat. Please use the Q&A function. We really want to hear from you directly. We want to know your thoughts on the advice in Melanie's book, how it may have helped you, or where you might still be struggling. We're so very grateful to Melanie for joining this evening and to all of you for being here and contributing to this conversation. Melanie, thank you very much. If you'd like to introduce yourself, and if I can ask what it was that motivated you to write this book, Fighting the Hate.
Well, thank you very much indeed to everybody for having me on this webinar this evening. It's a great pleasure to see you all virtually. The book arose out of a previous book that I wrote last year. I'm basically, as you may know, a British Jew. I still write for a British newspaper, the Times of London, as the Americans call it. And I have spent my career in British newspapers, starting at The Guardian, going through The Observer, the Sunday Times, the Daily Mail, and now the Times for several years. And I do a lot of public speaking. And in those decades that I've been writing, I think I joined The Guardian in the late 70s. I came to the conclusion quite early on, I would say in the early to mid 80s, that the people I thought were on my side were on a different side altogether. That I thought then, and I still think, that I was fighting the good fight for truth against lies, for justice against injustice, for the oppressed against their oppressors, against all forms of bigotry and tyranny. And I still remain true to those beliefs and principles, but what changed was my understanding of who was on my side and who was on the other side. Anyway, scroll on, I wrote a number of books. And last year, I wrote a book called The Builder's Stone, why Jews and Christians built the West and how only they can save it. And it was an attempt to analyze the looking glass world in which many of us felt in the West we were now living in which language had been hijacked. So what was true and real and just was being represented as the opposite. And it seemed to me that one could only understand the, to my mind, quite monstrous reaction of the West to the events of October 7, 2023, the Hamas-led assaults on Israel, and the war in Gaza that then followed. One can really understand the perverse reaction of the West to those events, or to many people in the West to those events, if one understood what the West had done to itself. Anyway, the book was published in January of last year, and to promote it, I visited Jewish communities in Australia and America and in Britain. And in each of them, I found a Jewish community which was absolutely traumatized, stupefied by the onslaught of hatred and irrationality that they were encountering, both in what they were hearing about what Israel was doing, which was a narrative composed almost entirely of lies, distortions, omissions, selective reporting, to present Israel as not only wrong, but positively demonic, the worst country in the world, run by people who were evil. And Jews in the diaspora, Jews who had nothing to do with Israel, they may have connections, they may have family, they may support it, they may not support it, but they were all being held collectively responsible for what Israel was alleged to be doing, and they were being subjected to verbal and physical abuse of an unprecedented kind, unprecedented in its nature and unprecedented in its scope, because this went across the West. It took different forms in different countries, different societies, but nevertheless, it was basically the same thing. And what I found among all these Jewish communities was people saying, what can we do? Is there anything we can do? We're up against something which is monstrous, but enormous and basically irrational. So what can we do collectively? And what should I do personally when I am faced with the kind of onslaughts that I have been subjected to? So I thought, well, I better make a stab at this. And so I went away and wrote this short book in which I've tried to go lightly on the analysis and concentrate on practical advice as to how best to respond, both as individuals and as a community. And it was written explicitly for Jews, because Jewish people are absolutely at the sharp end of all this. But there are many non-Jews who are finding this too. Many non-Jews who support Israel and who support Jews, Jewish people, and who oppose anti-Semitism. But also people who don't have a particular interest in any of those things, but are extremely concerned by the kind of gaslighting they are experiencing when they call attention to things that they think are going profoundly wrong in the West, and they themselves find themselves vilified. So I would hope that the kind of broader pieces of advice and if you like, insights that I offer can help people more broadly than the Jewish community.
I would say absolutely. I think so. I'm one of these. I'm an ally. I'm not Jewish. I'm a supporter. I'm one of the. I'm an ally, non-Jew, that saw the hypocrisy post October 7th. I'd started to be sort of to see it before, thanks to a good friend of mine who'd opened my eyes. That's October the 7th. The scales were lifted, and found myself suddenly having lots of conversations where I realized I needed to go and do a lot of learning very quickly and be very on it to be able to sort of manage every accusation that came my way. And that was exhausting, that needing to almost get an MA in the history of the Middle East in a very quick time period. And your book has given me, certainly, and many of the people, like a lot of women I speak to, those sort of skills to be able to start to push back without that fear that I don't have all of this knowledge and all of this experience to be able to counteract every single argument that's thrown and our way. And I think that's one of the things that comes up with your book, and that we see time and time again. This, what's the thing, make the Jew turn their pockets out. It is just throw as much as you can at the wall as you possibly can and see what sticks.
Yeah.
Which is something that we've been dealing with, especially on social media. Anyone that's been watching over the last week, it's been one of those weeks where we have had every accusation hurled at us under the sun. What about this? What about that? What about the other? And I wonder what your response is with the advice you've got in the book of how to handle that. What about this? What about that? What about the other? And how to manage that onslaught of accusations.
It depends entirely what the accusation is. And what I say in the book as a sort of general set of principles is that, first of all, the overriding consideration must be you must keep yourself safe. Whatever you do, you must not expose yourself to danger, unless you're the kind of person who wants to expose himself to danger, in which case you don't need my book. You need a martial arts instructor and a lawyer. But for those who are not like that, you've got to keep yourself safe. And then I lay down, or I suggest, certain sort of overarching principles, which is that and the first point to make is that there is no one template for this. Every situation is different. The accusations are coming at you or coming at us. They may come at us as shrieked insults from a passerby on the street. They may come at us over a she dinner party when you're least expecting it. They may come at us if you're a business woman, as I was told in Australia, you're negotiating a contract, and the other person, who I think was another woman on this occasion, in the middle of this negotiation, which was a like standard negotiation, suddenly said, "Why are you killing babies in Gaza?" Now, this is an Australian businesswoman who'd never been to Israel, as far as I know. Then there are different kinds of people. There are people who are attacking people like us from the left, from the right, who are friends, old friends. Some people have had the most appalling experiences of, friends from childhood who are no longer speaking to them. Worse than that, family members who are in the same position, colleagues. If you're a student, how do you maneuver around a very, very hostile and physically dangerous campus? So these are all very different situations, and the people at the receiving end are all very different. We're all very different. Some of us are naturally combative, naturally garrulous, naturally like to be up for an argument, and others of us are shy and timid, and we don't speak in public. And it very much depends on precisely what is being said to you and in what circumstance. And one of the overarching pieces of advice I give is that in all these circumstances, I think kind of at a subconscious level, we're all asking ourselves when these things happen, how do I respond? Do I fight or do I flee? Do I engage with this in some way? Or do I say, I am not going to go anywhere near this. I'm going to take the path of least resistance. I'm going to look after my job, my career, whatever it is, and then turn away. And that's a question that we all sort of ask ourselves. But if you're going to engage, then I think it's just as I'm afraid in Britain now, if you're a Jewish person in Britain, and this applies to a very, very large and growing number of Jews in Britain, you are constantly asking yourself, a question before you leave the house. Is it safe for me to leave the house wearing an identifying Jewish artifact, like a Magan David, a Star of David, out of my clothing? If I'm a man, can I wear a kippah on my head? Is it safe for me to walk down the street in this very Jewish area of Golders Green, which has had so many attacks in recent days? Is it safe for me to go across central London, where I'm going to possibly find people with kafirs, people holding flags, Palestinian flags on demonstrations. So we're all making, who live in Britain, Jewish people who live in Britain are making these calculations now, I'm afraid, all the time. And what I'm saying in the book, if in effect, is that I suggest that to feel comfortable in the kind of situations that we're all now discussing, Jewish people should equip themselves in advance with a kind of verbal armory, which they don't leave the house without, in which they have in their minds a few facts, a few lines to take, a few potential ripostes. These things may not be necessary at all. You may find yourself, never in a situation where having to use any of them. You may find yourself in a situation where you're having to use other kinds of ripostes. But I hope that by reading the book, you will be equipped insofar as you will reframe the way you're thinking so that what is an attack, and it is an attack on you personally, you don't respond in a way that makes it worse for you, that makes you feel that you haven't won this and you haven't even been able to respond, and should you have said something else and you weren't able to convince the person that they're so terribly wrong. And what I hope the book will give you the mental equipment to do is to equip yourself with the means to reframe what is an attack into an opportunity, which you can deal with in one sentence. If you're thinking in that way, if you have that way of thinking, and most of us don't have that way of thinking, and most of us are completely unprepared for all this. And, when these attacks happen, I mean, what do we feel? What do you feel? What do I feel? We all feel the same thing. We feel, first of all, we feel rage, the injustice of it, the horror of it. How can these people be saying this kind of thing? And then also fear, and then inadequacy. You're tongue-tied. So my book is an attempt to try and equip people to deal with all these different kinds of attack, these different kinds of situation, in a different kind of way.
So much of what you just said there resonates with me. It really does. Especially that sort of feeling of, is it feeling personal? You're being attacked as a person, and something I think so many of us, our followers, are the attendees tonight. There's so many of us are left-wing feminists. We've been on the marches. We've supported all the causes. We consider ourselves to, be progressive in our views and, support those that are victimized, all the rest of it. We're anti-racist, all of that. To then, some of us went through this with the turf wars, and we had to build that armor during the turf wars. But to then, be called the ultimate racist, the ultimate far right, the ultimate worst possible thing you can be. It's as if a very part of who you are as a fundamental part of who you are as a person is under attack and is being questioned by often those that you love and those that you have marched alongside and worked alongside and supported. I certainly know that one of the in fact, let me go to one of our first questions that got submitted. Susan submitted a question around that came up. We went to the the rally against anti-Semitism the other week outside Downing Street. And there was a lot of guilt by association for being there, because even though every political party spoke, someone from Reform spoke and was welcomed and applauded. So therefore, that must make us far-right Nazi bigots. But what Susan says is she went all around the audience or the crowd, giving out details about our organization and chatting to women that she met. And when saying that our next event was with yourself, there was a lot of, oh, wonderful, we love Melanie. And also on the other side, no thanks, we're not a fan of Melanie. Everyone knows who you are and everyone has an opinion, which is quite something. And so we're sort of sitting in this intersection of two sort of different groups of people, but who are joined on this one topic. I wonder if you can chat to us about this idea of sort of that guilt by association that so often gets thrown around in these situations when someone on the left speaks to someone on the right. And how do we find that unifying thing that sits between us all to overcome that?
Well, on the first question. It is an absolute polarization. It's not a question of what is being said. It's a question of who is saying it. And it's not even a question of who is saying it. It's if you know somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows the person who's saying this terrible thing, then all of them are suspect. It's guilt by association. This is redolent of ways of thinking, ideologies over many hundreds of years. It's taken different forms, but they are ideologies where they are kind of totalitarian ideologies. They do not permit any dissent whatsoever. And the dissenters have to be basically excised from the world. So, going back to, medieval England, you're looking at the great witch hunts, where people, and the Salem witch trials, where women were denounced and burned because of their associations, and because people with no evidence whatsoever formed conclusions on the basis of those associations. Scroll on, and you find exactly the same thing replicated in the Soviet Union. Where you were an enemy of the people if you knew somebody who was an enemy of the people, and you both got killed. You both got executed. And we're no longer in the age of physical burnings or physical executions, except, of course, when you get into the realm of terrorism, that's another matter. But we are very much in the realm of social and professional execution, ostracism, the destruction of your career, and the attempt to destroy you in public life, in the public arena, as a moral personality. Because the terrible thing about what we're living through is that the espousal of lies is presented as conscience. And this is a big conversation, perhaps it's too big a conversation for this particular discussion. But it's the most horrifying thing, in that people who are literally pointing fingers at people like me and denouncing people like us as enemies of the people and as enemies of humanity, believe that they are making a moral point. And you look at those people who are being dragged away on the what's it called? The Palestine Action. Palestine Action has been proscribed as a terrorist entity, and therefore people who go around demonstrating for Palestine Action have been arrested. And we've seen these people who are, they look like elderly church wardens, women, they look my age, and they look entirely respectable, decent people. And you can just see that they are pillars of their community because they believe in causes of, great conscience and morality. They believe that by upholding the idea that Israel is demonic, they are making a moral point. Now, why do they all think that? And why are people like me, and presumably people like yourselves, called not just wrong, but basically moral? We should all be treated as pariahs. We should not be accepted in civilized society. We are morally beyond the pale. Why do people think that? Well, I think there's a number of reasons. But if you look at what I would call the secular religion of human rights, the universalist position that transnational institutions and laws uphold peace and justice, they stand for a kind of, brotherhood of humanity, as it were, and consequently they fight the good fight which individual nations, because they are rooted in particulars of culture which are innately racist and white and exploited and all that. Those institutions, those transnational institutions, like the United Nations, like all its satellite courts, like the International Court of Justice, the International Court of the International Criminal Court, the European Court of Human Rights, and then the great NGOs, Amnesty, Save the Children, Oxfam. They're all singing from the same hymn sheet, that Israel is a white, it's actually brown, but anyway, Israel is a white, colonialist, exploitative, imperialist satellite of America, and therefore can do no right, and therefore has to be basically excluded from the community of nations. And so you have this vast infrastructure devoted to promulgating an enormous libel against one country alone in order to basically destroy it. In the case of the UN, by legal means, as much as anything else, but they support Hamas terrorists and all the rest of it. In the name of peace and justice and morality. And so if you have, as you do, an entire liberal, progressive section of the West, which is very considerable in number and commands the heights of Western culture, if you have that whole section of the population who believe absolutely that the UN and all this international humanitarian, human rights, universalist infrastructure stands for the nearest thing to a religion, which is the pursuit of goodness, peace, morality, justice, then anything it says is true. And anything that goes against that narrative is not only wrong, but evil. And so you have this terrifying situation in which the people who are coming for me and the people who are coming for you believe that they are doing so under the banner of morality. And this is what has messed with people's minds. And this is why we find it so difficult to argue against them. Because unless we understand what we're actually dealing with, you can't even begin to conceptualize a proper response. And even when you do understand it, it's difficult to do so.
I don't know, didn't see me there. I was nodding along to all of that. So everything you said, it absolutely resonates. As just a bit of an, I'm training to be a psychotherapist and studying Freud and Freud's idea of the two drives, Thanos and Eros. And it feels like we're almost in this existential worldwide battle against the two sometimes, with this fight. And if you're on the wrong side, you're the side of the devil and of death. And it's absolutely mad. And how do you manage that? Yeah.
How do you win?
Right, well, exactly. I have a list of questions here, but I understand we're getting loads of questions in from the audience as well, which is absolutely fabulous. So I'm going to hand over to the audience, and then if there's any of the themes that don't get picked up, we'll come back to them at the end. Ali, I believe you've been collecting questions from the audience. Did you want to ask Melanie the first one?
Hi, Melanie. So we've had some really interesting questions come in so far.
Right.
The first question, you very briefly touched on it, but Deidre asks, can you speak about the trope of Israel being colonialists, please?
The accusation Israel is colonialist.
Yeah.
It's an accusation which is made by people who have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. It is the reverse of what actually is the situation. Israel is far from being colonialist. Israel is anti-colonialist. Zionism is the great liberation movement against colonialism. For this reason, people who say Israel is colonialist have a set of assumptions in their minds, which I'm afraid are completely wrong. The main assumption is that there was a place called Palestine in which the indigenous people were the Palestinian Arabs, and that because of, broadly speaking, sympathy for the Jews after the Holocaust, the Jews were allowed to basically invade or conquer Palestine, drove out the indigenous people who were the Palestinian Arabs, and have continued to persecute those who remained ever since. Every single part of that is wrong. Every single part of that is historically, factually wrong. for this reason. People assume that the only reason why the Jews are in, or think they should be in, Israel is because of the Bible. And if you don't believe in the Bible, then you think it's all complete rubbish and nonsense. Well, that's not the case. The Jews are actually the indigenous people of the land. In that, Israel is the Jews are the only people for whom the land of Israel was ever their national kingdom, many centuries before Islam was even created. Now, the history of what happened is a long one, and I don't have time to go into it now, but scroll on many centuries during which there was always a Jewish presence in the Holy Land. Let's call it the Holy Land for the moment. After they were driven out by the Roman invaders, the Roman conquerors in 70 Common Era. But there was always a Jewish presence in the land because Jews, it's essential to the Jewish religion that you want to go back, that Jews should be going back to the land of Israel. There was always a Jewish presence. And from the mid-19th century, there was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. Now, scroll on to the beginning of the 20th century after the First World War. What happened then was that Turkey, or as it was then called, the Ottoman Empire, which had administered what we now think of as Palestine in those years, but it wasn't called Palestine then, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and they'd run it for several centuries. Well, they were on the losing side in the First World War, and after the First World War, the great powers, which was basically Britain and France, carved up the entire Middle East and created a whole number of new states, new Arab states. But they also returned the Jews, or they wanted to return the Jews to their ancient homeland. It wasn't a new state, it was their ancient homeland. And the international community decided that the Jews alone had the right to reinstitute their ancient homeland in Palestine. It was renamed Palestine as a kind of administrative thing. Palestine was then the area that was promised to the Jews to reinstitute their ancient homeland, which was called administratively Palestine, consisted of, wait for it, what is now the State of Israel, Gaza, and what's called the West Bank. In those areas, the Jews alone, according to the international community, enshrined in legally binding treaty, which was signed by Britain, which was to administer that territory, within that whole area, the Jews alone were to be brought back in order to reinstitute their ancient homeland. Now, you will ask, well, who was living there at the time? Surely it was the Palestinian Arabs. Well, the majority of people living there were indeed Arab, but they did not consider themselves to be Palestinian. The name was simply unknown. They considered themselves to be part of the Arab nation. Some of them considered themselves to be part of southern Syria. When the word Palestinian was used, in those years before Israel was created, between the First World War ending and the creation of Israel in 1948, when the word Palestinian was used, it was used to describe the Jews. Palestine National Post, Palestine National Fund, these were Jewish institutions. Anyway, the majority of people there at the turn of the century were indeed Arab, but as I say, they did not identify themselves as Palestinian. They were simply Arabs. And what then happened was, as the Jews began to return in order to reinstitute their homeland according to international law, according to the great powers, Arabs from neighboring states poured in on the very understandable and completely correct basis that the returning Jews would bring with them jobs and prosperity, which they did. And so Arabs poured in from neighboring states. And therefore, I mean, there's a longer story to tell about the fact that those Arabs, unfortunately, were signed up by their leader, their religious leader, who was Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. they were signed up to Hitler. It's not an exaggeration. The Grand Mufti did a deal with Hitler in which he said, if Hitler won the war, which was coming, if Hitler won the war, then he, the Grand Mufti, would ensure that every Jew was wiped out, not just from Palestine, but from the Middle East. Anyway, scroll on through many, many wars in which the Arabs never resiled from their stated ambition, their stated goal to destroy the Jewish homeland at birth and every decade since then. So the idea that Jews are colonizers is the opposite of the case. What the Arabs want to do, insofar as they still want to do it, and many of them no longer do, but what the Palestinian Arabs still want to do is to colonize the Jewish homeland by ethnically cleansing the Jews from it. They say not one Jew will remain in Palestine, by which they mean what is now Israel, as well as Gaza and the so-called West Bank. So it is the Arabs who are the colonizers. It is Zionism that is the great, great decolonization movement of the 20th century. Now, that's a long story, and it's about longer in its detail. What are your chances of persuading people who come at you and say Israel is colonizing? Israel is a colonizer. In the space of a very, very short exchange, which you're likely to have, the chances are very remote. So you have to find other ways of dealing with it.
Yes, as I say, it's when you have all of that and time and knowledge, and I think you need good faith from both people in the conversation to be able to actually explore all of that history, but to whip something out of your pocket when something's being lunged at you, it is that Zionism is actually decolonization.
Yeah. I think if one, the part of what I'm saying in the book is that, don't try to give people the history of the world. Don't think that you're going to change their whole way of thinking. You have to lower your expectations. The most you can hope for is to open what is a closed mind just a crack. If you manage to open it just a crack, then you've done terribly well. Now, how can you open it just a crack? You can, well, first of all, you use the attack to turn the tables. So you sow doubt in their mind. You sow doubt in their mind. You don't sort of try and give them the whole history, which I've just given you. It's useful to have that history in your mind. Indeed, you've got to have that history in your mind in order to have the confidence to make the reply that I'm suggesting you might make. If somebody says, why are you supporting, colonizing, whatever, then you simply say, I would suggest, I so agree with you that colonialism is a real evil. And do you know, Zionism is the great decolonization movement of the 20th century. And I'm amazed that you are in favor of Arab colonialism. That will set them back because they won't know what you're talking about. They will immediately be put on the defensive. They were making you on the defensive. You've turned the tables. They are now on the defensive. They may come back with an insult. They may storm off, but you have put a doubt in their mind. You've put them on the back foot. That is a great victory if you can do it.
It really is. Actually, that was a lot of the questions that came in. How can we be less defensive and come from a place that is less reactive and less sort of activated in that way?
Yeah.
It's very difficult. It takes practice.
It does, and you've got to do a bit of homework. You've got to sort of, you've got to accept your own ignorance. I mean, I was incredibly ignorant of much of all this until really just a few years ago. And it's only when you start reading proper history and following current events properly. Another question, how do you do that? It's only when you start doing that you realize the enormity of what we're all up against. So a bit of preparation is really essential.
Absolutely. Ali, I don't know if you've got another question that we can follow on from with that.
Yeah, so the second question is part comment, part question, Melanie. So she says, your story about The Guardian and realizing people you thought were on your side that actually stood for different things to what they professed to stand for was so eye-opening. The past few years with first trans extremism, then the anti-Israeli stuff, I felt like the ground has been slowly crumbling under my feet. It is better to see with clarity, and I have wonderful new friends. It has been hard. How did you cope in the 1980s at The Guardian with your faith in your tribe dying?
It was extraordinarily difficult. I mean, just to give you a sense of how difficult I found it, I think it was in 1982. This is another long story. I don't have time to go into it. It was 1982 when I first realized that the people who I thought were my soul brothers and sisters were on the other side to me, and that they were anti-Semites and they were racist. They didn't believe that black and brown skinned people had moral agency. They would not hold them responsible for what they did. And if you don't hold people responsible for what they do, you deny them moral agency, you basically dehumanize them. It's much worse than racism. You're dehumanizing them. So I realized this, and yet I couldn't bring myself to realize it, because you all know, as much as, you know, just like I'm about to say, you all know, I'm sure you all had this experience, or many of you will have this experience. It's like your family. Your family, you know, you wake up one morning and you find that your family has been abusing you. And you think, no, that can't possibly be. They are my family and I identify with them and I love them and they love me, don't they? Of course they do. You can't get your head around it. And so it was in 1982 when I first had this realization, and I stayed at The Guardian for another 10 years, or Guardian newspapers. I moved to The Observer, which became Guardianized. The Guardian bought The Observer and it became like the Sunday Guardian. And during those years, I was in a kind of internal exile. I lost all my Shishi friends in Camden Town and North London and Kentish Town. All those little dinner parties I used to go to stopped. We had fairly rudimentary email in those days. I can't quite remember what the system was, but it was very rudimentary. But nevertheless, we were, you know, office life is, you know, the pleasure of office life is that you're part of a community and you gossip. We were gossiping on email. The gossip stopped. I didn't get any more messages. And, you know, the tea trolley came round at 4 o'clock in the afternoon and people wouldn't talk to me. Now, this sounds like pathetic. And it also may sound rather self-serving. It may sound like I'm, you know, full of grievance, but it wasn't like that. I was bewildered. It took me a long time to work out quite what was happening, because it took me a long time to put together all these issues that I was falling foul of them over, none of which was to do with Jews at all, during all those years. Although in 1983 it was, but that's another story. But these were all basically social developments. And, you know, as soon as I began to question anything that was the orthodoxy of the left, I became literally overnight right-wing. I think the second op-ed I wrote in 1987, I wrote about education. And I said, something is going very badly wrong with education. That's that stage, I didn't know what it was, but I could see that something was going wrong with the kind of basic premise of education as the transmission of a culture down through the generations. And I said, not everything that's going wrong with education is the fault of Mrs. Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister. And the world fell in on me. I wrote that one day, and the next day I came into The Guardian, and my colleagues, my friends, said, have you gone mad? This is right-wing. And I thought, what? And it was literally like that, bang, over. And then I dug myself, for various reasons, further and further in. And it was excessively painful. I tell you, you say, you know, you found good friends, and I have now found, you know, very, very good friends, indeed. But for a long while, I was a kind of ideological orphan. I was expelled from Eden, the Eden of the left, and I found myself wandering into the arms of people that I had been educated to believe were the spawn of the devil, who were not the left, i.e. the right. Anyone who wasn't the left was the right. Anybody who challenged anything on the left was the right. And I didn't have much in common with them because they were starting from a different premise for me. This was during the time of the Thatcher government. And I thought then, and I think now, much more clearly, I think it now, that Thatcherism, it had certain things it did which were very necessary and very right. But basically, it suborned everything to economics and the idea that the free market would solve every problem in the world. If everything was run like Marks and Spencer, everything would be great. And this wasn't my tribe at all. I didn't believe that. I thought that was reductionist and terrible, and these people had no ideals. And so, but they embraced me because I was then at war with the left. And so I found, sort of, despite myself, that they were the people who gave me platforms, and they were the people who gave me companionship. I didn't like it. And it took me a long time to kind of find my own level. And then I got embroiled after the year 2000. I got embroiled in talking and writing about Israel. And then I really was out on a limb. And this is a very long story. All my stories are very long. But basically, this all started for me in the year 2000, when the world started falling in on me. In the couple of years after that, I was made to realize, sometimes to my face, that there was a choice to be made by British Jews. If they supported Israel, they were no longer to be considered properly British. And when I realized that, I realized that the British Jewish community, in my view, was on its knees, and I couldn't live like that. And that's when we bought the place here in Jerusalem. In 2005, we bought it. And I gradually moved my center of gravity to Jerusalem. And I now have a completely different life here. I come to London every few weeks in normal circumstances. I'm still very, very attached to Britain. I grieve for what is happening to it. I follow it very, very closely. I still write about it. But I now have a completely different circle of friends and supporters. And we are all here, my friends and supporters here, we are marching to the same tune. And I find those people now in Britain too. Not just in the Jewish community, but in the non-Jewish community, because things have moved on and have become so bad in many respects. I mean, the whole transgender thing, I think, opened people's eyes enormously to something that was going very badly wrong, well beyond the actual issue itself. How could the society have gone down this road is a big question. And so I have found many very good friends now in those circles in Britain too. And as you know, we're all reviled the whole time as being not just right wing, but ultra right, far right, fascist, Nazi, and in my view, insane. So,
Yeah.
Once they've called you that.
Well, yeah. Where can you go from that? Just use that to fuel the work that you do. And it's funny, as you were saying that, Susan, who I spoke about earlier, one of our co-founders, she said, not a question, but I was called a genocidal sow about 5 minutes ago. So it's all of that. So all of the insults, and interestingly, very ageist ones as well, that come along. But when you were talking about, sorry, I'm taking over. I'm reviewing and asking the questions. Ali's dog's woken up, so she can't be on the microphone because he's a barker. So I'm just trying to catch up with all the ones that have been asked. One of the ones that you were talking about, you do have supporters and you do have a community now, and not all Jewish. And I'm wondering how you see the role of Jews, not just Jews, but their allies, and the different roles that we may take up. So feminist against anti-Semitism is a mixture of Jews and non-Jewish people. A lot of our supporters, a lot of our members are not Jewish, we're allies. And so how do we differentiate what about how we can support and what's on us to do?
Well, I have to say, the Jewish community in Britain and indeed in America and throughout the diaspora, the Jewish diaspora is really rubbish at making alliances for all kinds of reasons. Mainly because Jewish communities in the diaspora are really very nervous and like to keep their heads down below the parapet. And this is particularly true of British Jews, who have had over many centuries a very checkered relationship with Britain. I mean, I don't know if you know the history, but Jews were, persecuted in the early Middle Ages and then thrown out in 1290 and were only allowed back under Oliver Cromwell and then under very severe restrictions, which were only lifted 2 centuries later. So Jews like to keep their heads below the parapet, and they don't think of themselves generally as needing to make alliances. They have a view that the outside world is fundamentally, the world beyond the Jewish community is fundamentally threat. And so they're very, very poor at making alliances. And so I think it's for the Jewish community actually to step up and say, we need to make alliances across these ethnic or religious boundaries. The other real problem, and it's much, much worse in America than it is in Britain, but it is significant in Britain, is that I'm afraid a lot of Jews in public life are signed up to the rubbish about Israel, to a greater or lesser extent. They drunk the Kool-Aid, and they're all the sort of progressive rubbish. So, you won't get Jewish community leaders in Britain ever talking about the disproportionate rate of anti-Semitism in the Muslim world and in the Muslim community in Britain. You will never get them speaking about that, ever. The only reference they will make is to Islamophobia being on an even level, on the same level as anti-Semitism. Now, if you believe, as I do, that Jew hatred is a real problem in the Muslim community, I say it's a real problem in the non-Muslim community for sure, but disproportionately among the Muslim community. If you say that, as I do, then the Jewish community leadership will call me Islamophobic. I mean, this is completely insane. Now, I don't know where on feminist issues per se, for example, transgender, I don't know how that ever lined up, but I would be amazed if there was institutional Jewish support for gender-critical feminists. Maybe I'm wrong. There would be certainly. I know there are individuals in the Jewish community who very much supported gender-critical feminists and were horrified by the whole transgender onslaught against freedom, against and against women. But in general, I would have thought that the community leadership would not have gone there because they wouldn't have put their heads above that parapet. But maybe I'm wrong. So they need to up their game. They need not to up their game. They need to change their game. They need to change the whole nature of their game. As far as non-Jewish feminists are concerned, I think, I'm sure, Jews in Britain are just so grateful for non-Jews who are speaking up for Jews and for Israel. We are all of us, so grateful. And so, keep on keeping on. I hesitate to say that because you're clearly paying a price for it. But at the same time, if feminism means standing up for justice and truth and the rights of individuals, standing up for equality in the way it's supposed to be understood, then I would say it's a moral obligation to stand up for Jews and for Israel. So maybe that's, and so thank you very much. But I mean, I think it would be quite hard for many of you not to take this position. But all I can say is that as Jews, we are so grateful for it, and so grateful for the allyship, as I think the word is nowadays. And I just wish that the Jewish community leadership would, get its head out of its backside and start, step up to the plate and start making proper alliances with people like yourselves.
Thank you. I think that's a really good observation around how we build those alliances. And I think that's something that we are trying to do as an organization, certainly within feminism, but potentially outside of feminism as well. And you're right. I think I get asked so often, and so many of us do, why are you standing up for Jews? Why are you doing this? No one asked me when I did a load of stuff with Iranian women and the Iranian diaspora. No one asked me why, but I get asked why all the time. And it's just because I'm a feminist and a human being. And this, that's why. Within that, you talking about the different sort of beliefs and the different groups, even within the Jewish community, we've got quite a few questions that have come up around how to deal with these differences within the community. So, for example, Jewish people who position themselves as anti-Zionists and do go on the marches. And within that, I think related to that question around anti-Zionism, this idea that Zionism is a bad word, that a Zionist is the worst of all people, that, I remember speaking to someone the other day who was, I support Israel, of course Israel can exist, but I'm not a Zionist. It's that belief that to be a Zionist is something bigger, is something deeper and darker, perhaps. So I wonder what you had to say around that, the sort of the anti-Zionist Jews and this idea of Zionism being labeled as the very worst, and how we might push back against that and be proud Zionists.
Yeah. I mean, so much of all this discussion, not this discussion, but I mean, the issue devolves upon people in the Jewish community saying, but it's all anti-Semitism. And it's like, please don't go down that road, because first of all, anti-Semitism is a really unhelpful word for various reasons, puts people's backs up, but also it's not quite the point. Anti-Zionism, there are different ways of responding to that, all of which I think are valid. Anti-Zionism should be considered as an evil in itself, a real evil, because it is inherently discriminatory. It singles out the Jewish people alone for not having the right to their own homeland in their own ancestral kingdom, their own ancestral homeland. There is no other people on earth, and there is no other country on earth that is subjected to this. However bad the regime, China, Russia, Pakistan, nobody ever says, they should be dismantled. And nobody ever says, the Kurds have no right at all to want Kurdistan. Okay, whether it's practical is quite another matter, but no right? So anti-Zionism in itself, it singles out one country in the world for lies and libels designed to delegitimize it in order to destroy it. That is hateful in itself. It is discriminatory. It is unhinged. It is obsessive. It is unhinged. That is anti-Zionism, anti-Israelism, anti-Israelism. Anti-Zionism, you can argue the same thing, but there's a further point to say about anti-Zionism, which is this, that people assume that Zionism, that being anti-Zionist or being anti-Israel is acceptable because it's against a political ideology, whereas being anti-Semitic is not acceptable because it's against Jewish people. Okay, that's the kind of iron division that is made. Now, this is very ignorant and wrong because, first of all, I think one should use certainly the formula that I used earlier, that Zionism is possibly the single greatest anti-colonialist movement of the 20th century. And immediately put people on the back foot. But there's something deeper than that, which is that this idea that Zionism is a political philosophy and therefore anti-Zionism is simply a matter of politics and therefore that's perfectly okay. No, it's not okay, because that's not what Zionism is. Zionism as a political movement got going, as we know, in the late 19th century for various reasons, centered around the personality of Theodor Herzl. Was then, it then morphed into the movement to reinstitute the Jews' homeland in the land of Israel. But Zionism is not a political movement. Zionism is an essential part of Judaism. Now, this is going to put a lot of people's hackles up, but bear with me. Zionism is simply the self-determination of the Jews in their ancient homeland, and Zion is absolutely central to Judaism. If you look at Jewish liturgy over the centuries, it's absolutely studded with references to Zion. Why? Because Judaism is unlike any other religion or ethnicity or whatever in the world. Judaism is a kind of three-legged stool. It consists of an unbreakable association, confluence between the religion, the people, and the land. What Judaism is, what religious Jews believe, is that they were given a set of divine commandments to live in a particular way by a particular set of rules in order to create a good society in a particular land. The laws are related to the land. Virtually all of them are rooted in that particular land. And you cannot break the three apart. Now, it is obviously the case that if you are a Jew who's not at all religious, you're still a Jew. You don't have to be observant religiously to be a Jew. You don't have to support Israel to be a Jew. You don't have to go and live in Israel to be a Jew. That's all true. But if you take the Zion out of Judaism, you destroy Judaism. So anti-Zionism, it may not be anti-Jewish people, but it is anti-Judaism. And that's what has to be said also, that it is an attempt to destroy Judaism itself. Now, people won't know what you're talking about when you say that, but if you say it, they will say, or perhaps they will just spit venom at you more and leave the room or whatever. But they may say, why are you saying that? That's ridiculous. What do you mean? And then you explain. And then you explain. And you say, why are you trying to destroy Judaism? And they'll say, well, it's rubbish, because you don't have to be a Zionist to be a Jew. And you say, correct, you don't. That's not what I'm saying. You haven't understood. So that's the conversation that also could be had. These are all reasons why anti-Zionism itself, leave aside anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism itself is fundamentally discriminatory and bigoted and hateful.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've learned something there, and what you just shared there. I'm going to be watching that back again when we do release this to be taking notes, because that's how you get the question rather than the attack, isn't it? That's how you open the door, by saying by bringing something in that makes someone actually question, like, hang on a sec, what? And then you can start to have the conversation.
And all you have to do is to make one sentence riposte, like I just said, Zionism is the greatest liberation movement, decolonizing movement, anti-imperialist movement of the 20th century. Stop. End. Then what's the reaction?
Yeah.
And it may be the reaction is still bad, but at least you've said it. You've said something that is true, that person never expected, that they have no idea about, and therefore it's in their mind. What did she say? What did she mean? And it may go nowhere, but you've opened that mind a crack. And if you do nothing else in that conversation, you've done very well.
Absolutely. And as you say, it's funny enough, it came up in our conversation as well, this thing about When do you say that's anti-Semitic? When do you say that's anti-Zionist? When do you say that how and what? And I know you're very against using that it's anti-Semitic, and I've struggled with that. But hearing you speak and what you're just saying there, it makes perfect sense now. It really has sort of come together.
Yeah, don't go down the anti-Semitism rabbit hole because for various reasons it will get you nowhere, and you don't have to go down that road unless somebody is saying, you know, Jews are, you know, demonic or spawn of the devil. Well, then you're in a different kind of conversation. That's not normally the conversation that is had. Although I have to say, increasingly, it is, you know, you Jews are all baby killers. So then you know, that's not the anti-Zion, but the anti-Zionism thing is the more common thing, I think. And that I think you can effectively have a riposte to without going down the whole anti-Semitism rabbit hole.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I think I've used the anti-Semitism stuff around sort of official complaints at university, for example, and that's been useful to be able to use the IHRA definition and be able to prove that the anti-Zionism is still, I think, more of a conversation than a process to look at tackling. One thing I've noticed, a question that I really do want to ask, we talked a lot about the big picture and some of these more bigger conversations and around communities and how we might act within them, but there's something here that brings it really to the personal. I'm not sharing whose names they are, because I think some people want to be anonymous, and there's been a bit of a tech issue with that. But the woman who's written out, I'll read her words. She said, "I'm feeling sad about a Zoom art group that I'm part of. The strongest person has friends all over the world who support the IRGC. They think Trump is mad. I know whoever supports, I can't even fathom it. They think Trump is mad and Israel is the evil one. I can't see a way of saying anything that will open her mind. Is it worth continuing just because art is the common love?"
Well, depends entirely on the circumstances. Is this woman entirely alone in a sea of hostility? Or does she perhaps have allies? In which case, you know, one should always try and make alliances. So, assuming that she's just alone, I mean, which of these accusations are all these accusations coming at her the whole time? Because she has to decide what hill to die on, what hill to fight on. Is she going to take on the anti-Trump stuff? Well, good luck with that one, quite honestly, because, you know, you're being asked to defend somebody who is, to put it mildly, erratic. And, you know, his own defenders have difficulty defending him. Is it the Zionism thing, in which case, you know, take in everything we've been kind of saying? If it's supporting Iran, well, that's a very simple thing to say. Because, you know, why are you supporting people who have murdered 40,000 people in January alone? You know, why aren't you supporting the women? Or I'm assuming it's a feminist thing, but it may not be. Why aren't you supporting the people of Iran who are fighting this? You know, who are too frightened to leave their houses because of this monstrous. You know, why are you supporting tyranny? Why are you supporting tyranny? And put them on the back foot. Why are you supporting this, or this? Don't make it too complicated. Don't make it everything. Single out one thing. Why are you supporting mass murderers? Why are you supporting tyranny? Why are you supporting people who murder women for showing their... Why are you supporting it? What do you find admirable about that? Always put them on the back foot. Ask them the questions. Keep your cool. It's very, very hard to keep your cool. Very hard. Because you want to say, you know, how preposterous, how this is ridiculous. Don't do that. Hone in on what's gonna unsettle them. Why are you supporting evil? And here it is. However, it may not be prudent for that person to do that. I mean, I don't know the circumstance. Is this coming at her in general conversation that she's not part of? In which case she has to make a decision. Does she stand up and say this? If there's like I don't know, in the refectory, whatever it is. Let's say there's a group of 5 or 6 people all having this conversation. How much they love the IRGC, how much they hate Netanyahu, how much they loathe Trump. Does she want to get into that conversation and stand up and say something to all those people? Maybe. Or is it a one-to-one? These are all very different situations. They require different calibrated responses. But I would suggest that if she wants to do something and she clearly feels badly that she doesn't do anything, think in advance of a few ripostes, of a few questions, a few, what it may even mean a joke, but puts them on the back foot, puts them on the defensive. She's accusing them of the worst thing that they can be, which is to be stupid, or much more viscerally important to them, moral. She's accusing them of taking a position which is monstrous. So they're on the back foot, they've got to defend it. Always now the rule, the sort of golden rule, wherever you can do that, do it, if you want to get stuck in.
Yeah, absolutely. She's responded to saying there's 3 on Zoom and the 2 agree with each other. So it's a very difficult situation to be in. And it was reminding me, I run a crafting group. We all crochet and knit and sew and things like that, and had to very quickly put in a rule that this is all, we just talk about knitting, we just talk about crochet. We're not talking about world politics. That is not happening.
Well,
otherwise this group is going to disintegrate.
Well, this is the point. So you have to make a decision. Do you want to continue in this group place of 3 people? Well, you may want to, in which case your response is going to be very different from if you say to yourself, I cannot deal with these people anymore. In which case you can say to them, the 2 of them, I thought we were all on the same side against tyranny, and I find you are actually supporting tyranny. How can you do this? But then, you've got to be prepared for the consequences, which is that your relationship with these 2 people is probably over.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what's so sad about all of this. And I'm going through the questions. There's a lot that's sort of quite similar, so I'm trying to group them together. But there's something, I think, which we haven't touched, you've mentioned, but we haven't touched on deeply, is there's one thing about our organizations and our communities letting us down and becoming places that are unsafe or that are difficult. There's quite another when it's your family. And we know women personally, members of our organization who are going through this. Perhaps they've married someone who is Jewish, Israeli, and so their family are not. And it's been, reasonably fine up until October 7th when all hell's broken loose. The family, are Free Palestine zealots. And it's becoming harder and harder and harder. To just be with them.
Yeah.
And that's something that sort of it's almost existential, rather than being able to sort of make that decision. Do I find a new tribe? Do I find a new group, or find a new family?
You can't. You can't. No.
Exactly.
They really are your family.
Yeah. I wonder if you have any thoughts or words for women that are going through that. I know there's more than one in our close group that have been really struggling with family members.
It's really difficult. I do address this in the book, but I'm afraid rather inadequately, because there is no adequate response to this. What I've said in the book is that, in my personal view, close family relationships have to be maintained. If it's your child, your sister or brother, your sibling, your spouse, your significant other, someone who's really, really close to you, and the relationship is very, very important, therefore, you've got to keep that going. You can't easily have a situation in which you are estranged from your child. It happens. I know people for whom it's happened, and it's tragic. And sometimes it's not in your gift to stop it, because sometimes the child, the spouse, the whatever it is, they decide that they can't deal with you anymore, and then it's over. And that's a real tragedy. If it's possible to keep the relationship going, I think that you must try and do that. And the way to do that varies depending on the relationship you have with that family member, how close it is, how easy it is for you to talk to them about other stuff. It depends on a number of things, but what is very common, and this is tragic and sad in itself, is that to keep the relationship going, you find ways of keeping it going on everything else but that. So you just never discuss it. And it's very hard, actually. If first of all, if it's central to your mind, everything you're doing, your mind and activities. And secondly, because, the world is in tumult, these things are being discussed the whole time. And it's very hard to avoid doing so. But it's possible, to recalibrate the relationship onto lines which are, let's say, domestic, about, family matters, about what you may think are really quite inconsequential things, but it keeps it going. And quite often the other person in this situation responds because they understand that what you're showing them is love. The love that conquers, the love that overrides other considerations. The love of a parent for a child overrides everything else. That's what if that person has any kind of sensitivity, even though they may be furious and outraged and horrified by your position, they respond to that. They respond on that basis, that, you're reaching out because you love them. And so that's perfectly possible to do in certain circumstances. It is incredibly painful, even so. But all the alternatives are much more painful. And as I say, it may be out of your control. So I don't really have an answer to this. And there are some families where, you can actually make some headway, but you've got to know you're dealing with. You've got to know if you can just introduce a few, open the door a crack with those people, your close family members. That may be possible. It may be possible to do that with them too. It may not be possible. And there's no easy answer to this.
Yeah. Do it's funny? There's another question as well that's been asked about how can we still, engage and be friends with and involved with the left. It's from an ex-Labour member. And there is something around almost having to just swallow a part of you in order to be able to still work with those that you might agree with on other issues, or to be able to have relationships with those that you love.
Yeah. It's a calibration which only you, the individual, can make, and it depends on how important that relationship is to you to keep it going. And if it's really important, to keep in with your friend from the Labour Party, then provided you can find a way of doing it comfortably, by talking about other stuff, then, the friendship may be worth keeping. I must say, however, if it's a Labour Party or, a signed up left-wing person for whom these ideological positions are of overriding importance, they kind of shape everything they think, then I struggle to think how one can establish a continuingly friendly, warm relationship. It may be possible, however, having said that, it may well be possible on the grounds of mutual professional engagement. So you're both involved in a Labour Party project, which you find valuable and important and worth doing, and the other person finds valuable, important, and worth doing. And so it's possible to to collaborate and cooperate with that person on those very narrow projects. But you may also feel that everything is infected by this terrible ideological deformation of mind. One can't lay down prescriptions for this. It depends on the circumstances for every individual.
Yeah, it's such a difficult one to walk and figure out. But that's one of the really positive things about our group, which I really love, is yes, it's a WhatsApp group for a lot of it, but just having that support of people, women that are going through something similar, women that share their pain, can try and help figure them out. It's one of the reasons I'm really proud to be part of Feminists Against Antisemitism. Yeah.
But also, I say something else in the book, which I think is something that sort of occurred to me, and I think it's quite significant. The people who are, our enemies in this respect, they write us off as basically spawn of the devil, to be exiled from all normal, human, decent society because we are moral pariahs. That's them. But we shouldn't and don't think of them like that. We shouldn't think of them like that, because what's behind a lot of this stuff, I mean, some of it is vile in the sense that it is without redeeming feature. It is based on sheer hatred and on prejudice and on bigotry. Okay, that is that category of attack or attacker. But in my personal experience and looking at what people are saying and where they're coming from, a great deal of this is coming from people who are motivated by decent impulses, by which I mean they want to be kind, they want to be compassionate, they want to be free of prejudice, they want to uphold justice, they want to uphold the rule of law in the world. These are noble aims. I share them. The tragedy is that they think that Israel, and by extension the Jewish people, are on the wrong side of all these things. So that's the major problem, that they've inverted the Jews and Israel in this moral universe. But I think it's important to reach out to them to the extent that you give them respect. You don't humiliate. Sometimes you do, but I mean, mainly you don't. Because you give them the respect of giving them to understand that you appreciate that they're coming from the same kind of moral position that you are. They're just fundamentally so wrong about so much. That doesn't mean you've got to start trying to explain it so that they then change their whole view. I'm saying that you should use the techniques that I'm advocating of turning the tables on them, turning defense into attack, and so on and so forth. Showing them up. But you can do it in a way which says we're on the same side, basically. So, for example, the people who support the IRGC. I mean, this is monstrous. But, surely, you and I share the same horror of tyranny. Or surely you and I share the same dislike of colonialism, the same opposition to colonialism. We share that. I accept that you think that I think that too. We both agree it's a terrible thing for children to die in war. We both agree. But and then you issue your zinger. So you disarm people because they're saying you are not in my moral universe. And we're saying, but you are really. It's just that you've taken this terribly wrong turning, and look how much you have grayed from your own ideals. You are now supporting terror, tyranny, child murder, whatever it is. So you do turn the tables on them, you're not sort of giving in. You're not sort of being nice and namby-pamby and all that kind of stuff, but you are giving them the respect of saying, actually we're on the same side. And first of all, it's right that we should do that. And secondly, it's disarming, hopefully.
Hopefully, yeah, absolutely. Do you know, as you were saying that, I was thinking about the recent issue we've had and the groups that are fracturing, and especially within, I know there's a question around the gender critical groups that are fractured, and actually, how can we change that story by changing the way we are, instead of, you know, defending, instead of you're just being anti-Semitic, you know, like how can we actually change that conversation, and bring some of that community back together within feminism. I'm very aware we've got 2 minutes left, and I would like to end on a high. There's a lot of questions that came in both before and during around resources. So what books can we read? What groups are out there? They're doing great stuff. I wonder if we might pick your brain afterwards. Maybe if you can send us anything that you recommend that we can then share with those that have bought tickets and with our group, with our community.
Okay, well, I've got a little list of podcasts and commentators, and I think 1 or 2 books that I actually put into my book. I've tried to be fairly eclectic. They're not all politically on the same page. They're not necessarily people I agree with on a number of things, but I think they're worth reading for people to start understanding the complexity of the Israeli position, and to start understanding some of its facts, which in turn open the mind up to the enormity of the libel and the big lies that have basically fried the Western brain. So I have made a stab at that, and I can excavate those and send them to you, or you can look at them.
Yes, we've got the book, so I'll grab the list for the book if that's all right, and we'll send out an emails. And if there's anything else you can think of that with writing your last book, anything that you think would be fabulous to read, or any organizations that are doing fabulous work that we should be looking at, connecting with, and building those bridges with.
Right.
That would be incredible. I know we are at time, but I would like, I'm not going to get in trouble, but I'm going to ask very quickly one minute of ending on a bit more of a positive note when it comes to feminism and when it comes to the work that we're doing. I wonder, do you see any hope? Do you see something positive, that we could be working towards for the future of trying to push back against this hate?
I do.
Yeah,
I do. I'm remarkably positive because I live in a positive country. If it wasn't positive, it would have died a long time ago. It's positive in the face of the most extraordinary adversity. I'm positive because I'm not Pollyanna-ish. I think that Britain and the West are in for worse in the immediate future. But where I'm positive is that there is a fight back underway. There are millions and millions of people who are decent, sane, ordinary people who may not think deeply about any of these things. They may not know much about any of these things. They're not ideological. They don't understand about, gender critical. They don't even know what it means. They don't think about Zionism ever. They don't know much about Israel and the Middle East. But they know in their gut something is going very, very badly wrong with reality. They feel that they're in a kind of looking glass world. Now, they're going to vote with their feet. Now, you may not like what they're going to vote for. In Britain, all eyes are on Nigel Farage and reform. He's a divisive character. Many people dislike what he stands for. Similarly, in America, Trump, most divisive. People can't stand him. People love him. They won't hear a word against him. They won't hear a word for him, and so on. But nevertheless, if you look at Britain, America, the West, generally Europe, there are millions of people who kind of know that this is unsustainable. That the essence of what made the West what it is, which is the place that the society that gave rise to unparalleled freedom and prosperity and decency and morality, is under great threat, and they're fighting back. And so I think there's everything to play for. I don't know how this is going to end. As I say, I think we're in for worse stuff in the immediate future, and the fight is going to become more vicious, and we have to be better organized in all kinds of ways. Better prepared, better organized, make better alliances, all those sorts of things. But the fight is on. And there's everything to play for, because there are millions and millions of people who are supporting us. By us, I mean people who are, sane, decent, moral, grounded, believing in all the good things to do with truth and justice, which you are, and I am. And we should never allow ourselves to believe the propaganda by which they hope to demoralize us, that we are alone, that we are off the charts, that we are all crazy, that we are absolutely isolated. It's not true. There are millions who are rooting for us. They may not speak the same language, but they are rooting for us. And it's just a matter of finding a better way to reach all of them and to make sure that their voices are heard.
Absolutely. As you were saying that, I was thinking of Eurovision and all those people that voted for the
Then you are.
people's vote. They're the silent majority are very much on side, I believe, anyway. Listen, we do have to end that there. Thank you so much for coming on to talk with us, Melanie. I've nearly finished your book. I think quite a few of us are working through that, and also Guardian Angel, it's called, I think, isn't it? But
Yes.
yeah, I've been listening to it. Many have been reading it. So thank you. You've given us so much to talk about and to think about.
Well, I'm extremely grateful to all of you for this opportunity, and it's been a great pleasure. And, you've asked some very good questions, and, I hope that my answers haven't been too inadequate.
Not at all. Honestly, I'm pretty sure we'll be inviting you back to dig a little bit deeper as well on some of the stuff we didn't get a chance to. To everyone that joined, I can see some people have been putting up hands. They've got more questions. I'm so sorry. We do have to end it. But thank you so much for buying tickets. As always, we'll pop a recording online in a few weeks' time. So anything that we missed, we can rewatch and make some notes. And we'll see you all at the next one. Thank you very, very much.